My youngest daughter called me at 2 in the morning. Not my eldest, not my son-in-law, not my wife's sister who sometimes called late when she'd had too much wine and wanted to talk about the old days. My youngest, the one who became a crown prosecutor in Vancouver, the one I'd driven 4 hours each way to watch graduate from UBC Law because her mother had passed the year before, and I wasn't going to let her walk across that stage without at least one of us there. She called at 2 in the morning, and the first thing she said wasn't, "Hello. Dad, don't sign anything. Do you hear me? Whatever they put in front of you tomorrow, you do not sign it." I sat up in bed in the dark. My back ached the way it always does now. This low, grinding thing that showed up around 63 and never left. "What are you talking about? It's 2 o'clock. "I know what time it is. Dad, just listen. I've been going through some documents that came across my desk today, and I need you to tell me something. Did my brother ask you to sign any papers recently? Anything about the shop?" I didn't answer right away. The shop. 41 years. I'd opened Mercer Hardware on Dunbar Street in 1983, the year after I came back from working the oil patch in Alberta with enough saved to do something real with it. I'd mixed paint and cut keys and ordered in special hinges for old Victorian houses and learned the names of every contractor in the West Side neighborhood. My wife, before she got sick, used to joke that I knew the plumbing of half of Vancouver personally. I'd built that place out of nothing, and I planned to pass it to both my kids equally, the way we'd always talked about. "He brought some papers by last week," I said. "Said they were just for the estate planning. Him and Roberta were helping me sort things out." She went very quiet. That particular silence, I'd heard it in her voice before, when she was choosing her words carefully in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. "Dad, those weren't estate planning documents. What they brought you was a power of attorney over the shop's assets and a transfer of the commercial lease into a numbered company. Do you understand what that means?" I understood enough. I'd been running a business for 4 decades. I wasn't an old fool, whatever they might have thought. A power of attorney over the shop's assets meant my son could make financial decisions about Mercer Hardware without my consent. The lease transfer meant the building, which I owned outright, paid off in 2009, could effectively be managed, refinanced, or leveraged by someone else. "I haven't signed anything yet," I said. I heard her exhale. "Thank God, Dad, you cannot sign those papers. Not tomorrow, not ever, not without a lawyer who works for you, specifically reviewing every single page. And I need you to do something for me right now, tonight. I need you to go downstairs and find whatever copies he left with you and put them somewhere safe. Not in your office. Not in your office, Anxious." "Why are you telling me this at 2 in the morning, sweetheart? What happened?" Another silence, shorter this time. "The numbered company those documents reference. I've seen it before. In a file that has nothing to do with you. And if I'm right about what I think I'm seeing, Dad, you need to understand that this is serious. I can't tell you more than that right now. But please, lock those papers up. Don't tell my brother we talked, and don't let Roberta in the shop tomorrow on any pretext." I sat in the dark for a long time after she hung up. The house felt different. Houses do that sometimes. The same walls, the same creak of the floorboards, the same streetlight coming through the curtains, and yet somehow the air inside changes when you learn something that rewrites the past few months. I thought about the past few months. My son had moved back from Calgary in the spring. 52 years old, divorced for the second time, between jobs in the way that had been recurring since his early 40s. I'd been glad to have him closer. After his mother died, the house felt too large for one person, and I suppose I'd been lonelier than I admitted to myself. He'd come by the shop most days, introduced me to Roberta, the woman he'd been seeing, who had bright eyes and a warm handshake, and who started helping at the counter on slow afternoons. I'd liked her. I'd trusted her. She had a way of making things feel organized and calm that I found genuinely restful at 71. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. Instead, I'd let my son take over the bookkeeping. He said it was to give me a break, said I'd been doing it all myself for too long, and that he wanted to help. He had the accounting background, he reminded me. The 2 years he'd spent at BCIT before switching programs. I'd been grateful. My eyes weren't what they were, and the software the accountant had moved me to in 2019 still felt like a foreign language. I hadn't looked closely at the books since March. I went downstairs, found the envelope my son had left on my desk, and locked it in the fireproof box in my closet where I kept the shop's original deed and my wife's will. Then I went back to bed and lay there until morning. I didn't sleep. My daughter drove up from Vancouver the next day. She arrived at the shop before I opened, parked her car around the corner, and came in through the back the way she had as a kid when she used to help me restock on Saturdays. She sat across from me at my workbench in the back room and laid out what she'd found. The numbered company, 1147823 BC Limited, had been registered 8 months ago, before my son came back to Vancouver. He and Roberta were listed as directors. The company had already been used to secure a line of credit against a commercial property in Burnaby, a property I didn't own and had never heard of. But the credit application had listed Mercer Hardware as a secondary asset. My daughter slid the printout across the table. Someone represented to the lender that you'd agreed to this, that the shop was available as collateral. I looked at the paper, at the name at the bottom of the credit application, which was my son's name, at the date, which was 4 months ago, at the asset description, which was accurate down to the square footage of Mercer Hardware's retail floor. He used my shop as collateral on a loan I don't know about, I said. Without your authorization, as far as I can tell. The question is whether the power of attorney he was trying to get you to sign was meant to cover that retroactively, or to enable something bigger. She folded her hands on the table. Dad, I have to be careful about what I say to you because this is complicated professionally for me. But I need you to get a lawyer today. A commercial lawyer, not the family lawyer who did Mum's will. Someone who does business fraud. Business fraud. I sat with those words for a moment. 41 years. I'd never had a dispute that went past a handshake and a straight conversation. I'd never needed a lawyer for anything other than real estate. And the one time a supplier tried to charge me twice for a pallet of copper fittings. What about Roberta? I asked. She's a co-director. She knew. I thought about Roberta at my counter, cheerfully helping a customer find the right grade of sandpaper. Roberta, who'd brought me coffee from the place down the street and said I worked too hard for my age. Roberta, who had warm eyes and a warm handshake, and who had been sitting in my shop learning its rhythms and its cash flow for 3 months. Right, I said. Okay. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Isabel Tran, and she had an office on West Georgia and a voice on the phone that made me feel, for the first time in several days, that things might actually be manageable. She told me not to let anyone access the shop's back office until she'd had a chance to review the documents. She told me to change my bookkeeping software passwords that evening. She told me gently but clearly that what I was describing sounded like financial elder abuse, and that it was more common than I probably realized, and that there were specific legal remedies available in British Columbia. Financial elder abuse. Another phrase I sat with. I was 71 years old and I had never thought of myself as someone who needed protecting. I'd spent 35 years dealing with difficult customers and difficult suppliers and the occasional difficult tradesperson who tried to cut corners in ways that could get someone hurt. I'd always handled things myself. I changed the passwords that night, all of them. My son called the next morning, cheerful and casual, asking if I'd had a chance to look over those papers yet. He wanted to come by and go through them with me. Him and Roberta said we could get it all sorted out over lunch. I said I'd been busy and I'd call him back. He called again that afternoon, less cheerful this time. By the end of the week, Isabel had reviewed the documents and confirmed what my daughter had suspected. The power of attorney was written to be broad enough to give my son control over all business decisions at Mercer Hardware, including the ability to sell assets, enter new leases, and borrow against the property. Combined with the numbered company and the existing unauthorized credit application, the picture was clear. He was building the infrastructure to drain the business, Isabel told me, slowly, in a way that would be hard to trace until significant damage was done. The unsigned POA would have been the final piece. The credit line taken out against the numbered company, with Mercer Hardware listed as a secondary asset without my consent, turned out to be the critical mistake. That was the piece that crossed from civil wrongdoing into potential criminal fraud. Isabel referred the matter to a forensic accountant and, through proper channels, to the RCMP commercial crimes section. The investigation took 4 months. I kept the shop open the whole time because I wasn't going to let what they'd done close the place I'd built. Some days it was hard. Some days I'd be mixing a custom paint color for a regular customer or helping a young couple figure out what grade of weather stripping they needed for an old house. And I'd think about my son and feel something I didn't have a clean word for. Not anger exactly. Something more tired than that. He called several times during those months. I answered twice. The conversations were short and careful, both of us knowing things we weren't saying. He never apologized. He did ask, the second time, whether I was still planning to list him in my will. I didn't answer that question. The RCMP finished their investigation in October. My son was charged with fraud over $5,000 and 1 count of unauthorized use of a credit instrument. Roberta was charged as well. Their lawyer tried to argue that there had been a misunderstanding about what I'd consented to, that it was a family communication breakdown, that my son had genuinely been trying to help. The forensic accountant's report made that argument difficult to sustain. Isabel kept me updated throughout. She was straightforward and never told me more than I needed to know, which I appreciated. She also told me when the charges came through that the civil claim we'd filed separately was solid. We were suing for unauthorized use of Mercer Hardware's name and assets, plus damages for the stress and disruption to the business. My daughter came up for Thanksgiving. We had dinner at the house, just the 2 of us, roast chicken, because neither of us had felt like doing a full turkey since her mother died. We sat at the kitchen table and she told me about her cases in the careful general ways she always did, never identifying anyone, just the shapes of human behavior that kept turning up in her work. Greed mostly, sometimes desperation, often both at once. I keep thinking, I said at some point, about how long it must have taken him to plan this, to come back here, to bring her, to go through all that effort. She was quiet for a moment. I think he told himself it was going to be fine, that you'd sign the papers and you'd never look too closely, and eventually he'd pay it all back, or the business would absorb it. People who do this usually have a story they tell themselves. Do you think he loves me? She looked at me across the table. My daughter, who had driven 4 hours at 2 in the morning's worth of worry to tell me not to sign a piece of paper, who had sat in my back room and shown me evidence of what her brother had done with the quiet, devastating steadiness of someone who did this for a living and was barely holding it together. I think he does, she said carefully. I think he loved the idea of what you had more than he loved you. That's not the same thing. I thought about that for a long time after she drove back to Vancouver. The court process moved slowly through the winter. My son's lawyer negotiated. The Crown indicated they were prepared to go to trial. In February, just before the trial date, my son accepted a plea. Fraud over $5,000, 1 count. The sentence was 2 years less a day, served in the community, along with a 5-year prohibition on holding any financial directorship. Roberta received a conditional discharge and restitution obligations. Isabel called me when it was done. How are you feeling? She asked, which lawyers don't always bother to ask. Strange, I said. I thought I'd feel relieved. People often don't, not right away. I feel like I lost 2 years pretending things were going to go back to normal. They won't go back, she said, but forward is still possible. I appreciated that. She was a practical woman. The civil claim resolved a month later. My son didn't contest it. The judgment was for $68,000 to be paid in monthly installments over 8 years, which his lawyer acknowledged might take longer given his current financial situation. That was fine. I wasn't doing it for the money exactly. I was doing it because consequences should exist, because 41 years of work deserved to be accounted for. I updated my will in March. My daughter was the sole executor. My son was left a specific amount, enough that no one could argue I disinherited him improperly under BC law, which my daughter had quietly explained to me when I asked, and no more. The shop I left to my daughter with the option to sell or continue, her choice. She'd earned it by answering the phone at 2 in the morning. Spring came early that year. I started opening the back door of the shop in the mornings to get the air through, the way I'd done for years. The neighborhood had changed a lot since 1983. The old hardware stores were mostly gone, replaced by the big boxes out in Burnaby and Coquitlam. But Mercer Hardware had survived because people on Dunbar still wanted someone who knew the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt, and who would spend 20 minutes with them figuring out why their bathroom faucet was still dripping after they'd replaced the washer twice. I'd hired a part-time bookkeeper. Her name was Janet, and she had 20 years of small business accounting experience and a manner that was entirely no nonsense, which I found deeply reassuring. She came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and kept things properly documented in a way that I realized, in retrospect, I had been dangerously casual about before. My daughter visited more often now. Sometimes she brought her partner, a quiet man named Tobias, who was a high school physics teacher and who turned out to know a reasonable amount about plumbing, which gave us something to talk about. She seemed lighter. I think I did too. One afternoon in June, I was restoring an old Stanley handplane someone had brought in, not for sale, just for my own satisfaction, the way I sometimes took on small restoration projects when the shop was slow, and I thought about my son. He was living in New Westminster now, I'd heard through a mutual acquaintance, working at a building supply warehouse, apparently. I didn't know whether this was true or whether it was the sort of thing people said to fill a silence. I hadn't spoken to him since February. I wasn't ready to. Maybe I would be someday. Maybe not. What I knew was this. I was 72 years old. I had a shop I'd built with my own hands that was still standing on Dunbar Street. I had a daughter who had driven through the night for me. I had a good accountant and a good lawyer and a back room full of small hardware restoration projects that nobody was paying me for, but that I found genuinely satisfying. I had regular customers who came in for the conversation as much as the supplies and who knew my name and whose names I knew. The handplane came apart cleanly. I cleaned the rust off the sole with a bit of oil and some patience, checked the blade, found a hairline crack in the frog that could be stabilized with the right epoxy. Salvageable. Not perfect, but salvageable. Some things, given the right work and the right time, could be put back in order. I set the plane on the workbench and went back out to the counter. A young woman was trying to figure out what size of picture hook would work for a heavy mirror without damaging the plaster. I knew the answer. I'd been knowing the answers to questions like this for 41 years, and I planned on knowing them for as many more as I had. That, in the end, was the only revenge that felt worth having. Not the judgment, not the sentence, not watching someone get what they deserved. Just this, still here. Still open, still useful, my name on the door and the keys in my pocket, and not a single thing in this shop that anyone had managed to take from me. I keep thinking about the moment I locked those papers in the fireproof box. 2 in the morning, house quiet, the same house I'd lived in for 30 years. I stood there in the dark, holding an envelope that my own son had left on my desk. And I had to make a choice about whether I trusted my daughter or whether I told myself there had been some mistake. That moment, that small, ordinary moment in a hallway, was where everything turned. What I've come to understand is that things like this don't happen suddenly. They happen slowly, in small steps that each seem reasonable on their own. Letting someone take over the bookkeeping. Being glad for the company. Telling yourself that family means giving people the benefit of the doubt. None of those things were wrong in themselves. But I stopped paying attention, and attention, I've learned, is not something you can afford to outsource when it comes to what you've built. My daughter paid attention. She saw something in a document that crossed her desk and she followed it at 2 a.m. because she knew it was right to follow it even when it was hard. That's not a small thing, that kind of honesty. The kind that calls you at 2 a.m. rather than waits until morning. The kind that says the uncomfortable truth to the person who needs to hear it. That takes something real. It takes a person who has decided that doing right matters more than keeping the peace. I've thought about my son a lot since February. I don't hate him. I've tried to be honest with myself about that because I think it would be easier in some ways if I did. But what I feel is closer to grief than anger. He had every opportunity. He had a father who wanted to include him, a business that could have been something for both of us, a family that was still intact and willing. And he looked at all of that and saw something to take rather than something to tend. That's the part that stays with me, not the fraud charges, not the civil judgment, not the 2 years of legal proceedings. The fact that he had the intelligence to build something and chose to use it to dismantle what someone else had built instead. Intelligence without integrity is just a sharper tool for doing damage. I've seen that clearly now in a way I couldn't have articulated before all of this. What carried me through it was something simpler and harder than I expected. It was just the decision made over and over again on difficult mornings to open the shop, to show up, to keep knowing the answers to the questions customers brought through the door, not because it proved anything to anyone, but because the work itself was worth doing, and I wasn't going to let someone else's choices take that away from me. That's the only version of strength that ever made sense to me. Not the kind that shouts or retaliates, the kind that gets up, does the job, changes the passwords, finds a good lawyer, and keeps going. 41 years of that kind of strength built Mercer Hardware. It's what kept it standing when everything else was shaking. My daughter asked me once early on if I was okay. I said yes and meant about 60% of it. By spring, I meant most of it. That's not a small thing either.